1 year ago today that President Barack Obama was elected president. And to help us take a look back on how he has performed in the job since his inauguration in January, we have on the WILM Newsline the Pennsylvania Congressman, former naval officer, Joe Sestak. Let's see, where is the Congressman? There you are. Morning, Congressman. How are you?
Good morning, John. It's good to be back.
I know you're very busy, so we won't take up too much of your time. But thanks for being with us this morning. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you grade President Obama?
I think he's been up there at least an 8 and approaching a 9 if he is successful in getting the health care reform through and addressing correctly and well Afghanistan.
But I mean, aren't you going a little overboard here? A 9 or a 10? He's only been in office for 9 months, 10 months.
Well, I actually said an 8 or a 9.
Oh, I see.
And number 2 is, here's why.
Yeah.
When he took over, he was dealt a pretty weak hand. Remember, the Republicans had actually doubled our national debt from $4.5 trillion to $10 trillion and run our economy aground and left Afghanistan, in the words of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, spiraling downward. So here's what he's done. He has actually stopped the cratering of our economy. Is it intense? Yes, John, but it's not intensifying. You can see it in the numbers. Every month, January, February, March, when he took over 9 months ago, it was actually handed to him by President Bush 700,000 job losses each month. We're about 250,000 in this last month, and they're declining. Is it tough? Yes, it is. But, you know, when a ship gets hit by a torpedo, you've got to put caulking in the hole to stop it from sinking very quickly.
Yeah.
Now we're bailing out the water. The test is going to come, I think, in this health care reform, if he's successful in getting through a comprehensive approach that not only covers everyone, but also begins to slow down the cost of premiums. If we don't do that, then Americans who have their private health care plans and can keep them under his proposal aren't going to be able to afford it. And that's why the public option is absolutely critical. And third, Afghanistan. What a weak hand he was dealt there. I'm in support of a measured increase in troops, as long as everyone understands the goal is truly only Al-Qaeda safe haven that exists in Pakistan, and that there are benchmarks to measure our success or failures that can trigger an exit strategy if the success is not coming about.
Well, with the runoff election in Afghanistan called off and President Hamid Karzai set for a second term, will the Afghan people accept that since his first term and his re-election are seen as full of corruption? Will the president's warning to Karzai to focus on tackling corruption be enough to legitimize the Afghan government?
I think the administration would be wrong to base its strategy, which needs to be in our American interest, upon a very corrupt central government that, irregardless as that election would have come about, even if the opposition member had stayed in and been elected, would have taken years to fix that corruption. We cannot partner ourselves in a strategy that relies upon them for success. That's why General McChrystal's strategy is wise, and I think the president's about to pursue it, which says, look, it's not about the central government, because we're not going to try to nation build. What it means is we're going to build conditions on the ground by making liaisons and alliances with local warlords, local tribal chiefs, and even the 70% of the 20,000 Taliban that are in Afghanistan that are there truly just for a wage, because they get paid 3.5 times what a police officer does, those Taliban soldiers. And so therefore, making those alliances locally and leaving conditions that are inhospitable, hopefully, to Al-Qaeda coming back as we redeploy is the right strategy. I have argued that anyone who thinks we should be trying to rely on a strategy that marries us up in dependency upon that corrupt central government, no. We let this war spiral downward as we had our focus on that, as you know how I felt about it, John, that tragic misadventure in Iraq. And therefore, it's too far down to bring it up by the bootstraps at a decent cost in order to rebuild that nation with a representative, democratic, non-corrupt central government. It's the locals that we have to depend upon in order to execute the strategy of eradicating al-Qaeda's safe haven and leave behind a probability of conditions that inhospitality to al-Qaeda would be the result if they try to come back.
Well, a lot of those locals are simply mercenaries fighting with the Taliban and so forth. And we are, from what I'm reading, from what I'm hearing, the Obama administration is talking about maybe we will hire those mercenaries to be on our side. What do you think?
Well, you know, John, I went into Afghanistan on the ground for a short mission near the beginning of the Afghanistan war back in 2001. And I flew in, and sitting right beside me was a CIA gentleman with a suitcase clipped to his wrist, filled with millions of dollars to buy loyalty. In short, we have to accept, John, that before we went into Afghanistan, we told the Taliban, kick al-Qaeda out and we won't come in. They didn't kick al-Qaeda out, so we came in. John, that nation, unfortunately, could have been something. And I saw it at the beginning of the war. But unfortunately, we didn't leave our special forces, our psychological operations forces, civil affairs forces that could have provided a secure edifice so the elements of our economic and international economic power, diplomacy, rule of law, education could have taken root. To now, John, because it has spiraled so far downward, buying off by economic means that you can give farmers a different crop to grow than poppy seeds, that you're able to give them microloans, that you're able to say, look, here's what we're going to do, it's at less cost as long as you're inhospitable to the al-Qaeda, is the best that we probably can do at acceptable cost. I don't like it, John, but on the other hand, it would be an open-ended commitment, and I don't think our country can afford that. It's al-Qaeda. Why we went in, it's al-Qaeda that we must eradicate in the safe haven in Pakistan, closing the door in a pincher movement, so to speak, as the Taliban that are in Pakistan and are very radical are pursued by the Pakistani army as they move towards al-Qaeda's strong hideout. It's not a perfect strategy. It depends a lot upon Pakistan truly going after those forces of ill will that are in their country, but that's why I say we need benchmarks to measure success and failure. And if it doesn't work, an exit strategy that becomes one that's called a containment strategy, where we look closely, we see if al-Qaeda is coming back, and surgically we go in so that they can't plan against us.
Pennsylvania Congressman and former Naval Officer Joe Sestak on the WILM Newsline. Let's get back to politics here at home. Now, during the campaign, President Obama, as the as the campaigner, he was promising how he would govern, be bipartisan, transparency in government, changing the way things are done in Washington, a robust health care reform, and so forth. How's he doing in those areas?
Well, unfortunately, the bipartisanship effort has foundered, as you know.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have seen a lot more come about. I don't fault the president alone. Look, we lack the titans in Congress, the Sam Nunns of old, the Henry Jacksons of old, that could stand up and reach across the aisle and bring about compromise, both in the House and the Senate. And quite frankly, John, it's the reason I'm running for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania, because I believe that Pennsylvania needs a titan that can reach across the aisle. But I believe in democratic principles like the issue you just brought up, health care. I think strongly, John, that having watched the Clinton health care plan get derailed in the 90s, in fact, you know my opponent, Arlen Specter, helped derail that. Since that time, and I was in the Clinton White House at the National Security Council as Director of Defense Policy, we saw that 10 million Americans lost their health care. In fact, every day, 14,000 Americans lose their health care. That's the equivalent of Bethlehem in 1 week or Allentown the following week. In short, doing nothing's not an option. What we have to do, though, is not just cover everybody. And why is that important? It's because we lose $260 billion a year in economic productivity from our GDP. It's an economic issue as well as a moral issue. Number two is 94% of all health insurance markets in America are, according to the Department of Justice, criteria are non-competitive in their pricing. Take Pennsylvania. 2 companies have 70% of all the private health care plans. It's like a monopoly. They dictate prices. That's why the public option, which is a choice, it's not any, you don't have to pick it, but if you choose it, it's going to have lower premiums, and it forces those 2 big giants in Pennsylvania to begin to lower their premiums instead of keeping, like one of them has, $3.5 billion in reserves and making more in profits. We've got to change that, and that's what this is about. And so a big mark, when you ask me how he's doing, will be whether that reform of the cost of health care comes about, as well as covering everyone so that we have a more productive economy.
So, Congressman, tell me, why is it that having control of both houses of Congress and the White House, the Democrats can't get their health care reforms passed into law? What's
because I need to be there in the Senate. That's why I'm running for it, is because I find that politicians, unfortunately, you know me, John, I grew up 31 years in the U.S. Navy, and I watched the lack of accountability, people who aren't willing to stand up and say what they're for and fight hard for because they're more worried about their jobs, like my opponent, Arlen Specter, switching parties. John, look, you and I don't always agree on all the issues, but you're willing to listen. And I'm willing to stand up and say, here's what I believe, and explain why logically, not in a way that says, well, I just believe we have to cover it. No, it's economically necessary. You know my advanced degrees in economics. And so my belief is, John, as it gets back to the issue, politicians tend not to want to be standing tall for principled, accountable leadership. What they do is they take polls and see where they should do it, and we've got to change that, because the biggest damage to America is not this savage economy. It's not just that we don't have health care. It's that Americans have lost faith and trust in their public officials and therefore the public institutions, the offices they hold, and that more than anything has to change.
Let's talk a little bit about your military expertise. Now, former Vice President Dick Cheney, as I'm sure you are well aware, accuses the president of dithering on the issue of Afghanistan. Now, as a former naval officer, I take it that you disagree with him, but how would you advise the president on this issue? I know you've talked about it so far, but if you could get his ear, what would you tell him?
Here's what I would say. First, with regard to Dick Cheney's comments on making a decision, that I was glad up till now that the president has taken a comprehensive, deliberate approach to it, because he doesn't only have to take into consideration General McChrystal's strategic approach and tactical approach to Afghanistan. What he has to keep in mind as the commander-in-chief of all our armed forces is that we have an army that cannot respond and hasn't been able to for 4.5 years because of its low state of readiness, because we just focused on Iraq and we do no training in maneuver warfare, artillery warfare, tank warfare, that we don't have an army that can respond to any other war plan in our arsenal, including defending, for example, South Korea. So he has to take into account a larger picture of, if I do this increase in troops in Afghanistan, what's the impact on the rest of our national security fabric? So I'd liked his approach. However, it is time, John, I believe, to now, I would advise, come to closure. We've had good deliberation. I'm sure he's taken all these things into account.
But
I would advise he close it and support a measured increase in troops under the goal of Al-Qaeda's safe haven is what it's all about, with benchmarks that can trigger an exit strategy if success isn't working, because we can't afford an open-ended commitment. And third, we only try to leave behind the probability of conditions in Afghanistan on the local governing level, not with the central government, because that costs too much to change them, and that Al-Qaeda will not be welcomed back.
So you seem to be saying that if we can't get anything done as far as what we're trying to accomplish, we should just leave.
No, there's an alternative strategy. You always have to, in my opinion, assess cost and benefits. For example, Iraq. People say it costs $700 billion. No, they're wrong. It's going to cost $2 trillion because of the post-traumatic stress disorder and the treatment of our soldiers and Marines coming home that need that type of treatment. Is that war was that war worth it? I would argue no. And halfway through it, the failure to change our strategy to work with Iran, where I believe the road out of Iraq was diplomatically through Iran, and a different approach could have brought a closure to that war more rapidly, I believe. Now, number two is, what I'm saying in Afghanistan is, like any war, I believe that if this strategy, which I've gone through the classified report, does work out, and I think there's a decent chance it will, it's worth doing it. But if it doesn't work out and the costs become just continuing to harm the readiness of our Army, because we can't keep it basically broken forever, and I don't mean the men and women who go forward, I mean when you come home that they're not ready to respond anywhere else, then you say, is there an alternative strategy? And there is. It's not as good, but it might be effective enough with some more development of some systems where we are able to listen in more closely, where we're able to just leave covert forces there. We use more unmanned air vehicles in order to try to see where Al-Qaeda is, and as they move in, we surgically strike them. I'm not saying it's the right strategy right now, but I'm saying that you just don't keep banging your head against a wall when there might be an alternative way at less cost, with a little bit more risk in order to take it. It's just that you got to, as President of the United States, I believe, continually weigh cost and risk. There are alternative strategies. Right now, I believe that General McChrystal's is the correct one.
Congressman, listen, I wish we had more time, but we have run out of time. I really
Don, I'd
appreciate
love to
you
come
being
back
with us.
because this is my duty to at least let people know, particularly as I'm running for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania against Arlen Specter, where I sit on the issues, because principled, accountable leadership is what we need.
Congressman Joe Sestak, thanks again, Congressman.